The shadow in the window. The rain was relentless, hammering against the windows with a force that made the glass shudder. The wind howled like a creature in pain, whipping the trees outside into a frenzy. It was the kind of night that made you grateful to be indoors, surrounded by warmth and light. I had just finished cleaning up after dinner and was getting ready for bed. The storm outside was a perfect backdrop for a cozy evening, but it also carried an undercurrent of unease that I couldn't quite shake. As I moved through the house, turning off lights and checking locks, the wind seemed to grow louder, more insistent. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the comforting routine of preparing for bed. After brushing my teeth, I walked over to the bedroom window to draw the curtains, hoping to block out the storm and the eerie feeling that had settled in my chest. That's when I saw it. Standing just outside, in the middle of the downpour, was a figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the swaying trees or the distorted reflection of a street lamp. But as I squinted through the rain-streaked glass, I realized that the figure was real. It was a person, drenched and motionless, staring up at my window. My heart skipped a beat. The figure was tall, its outline barely visible through the sheets of rain. There was something off about the way it stood, so still in the chaos of the storm. I couldn't make out any details. No face, no features, just a dark, looming silhouette. It didn't move, didn't even seem to flinch under the barrage of rain. It was as if it was waiting for something, or someone. A wave of fear washed over me. I instinctively pulled the curtains closed, blocking the figure from view. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped back, my mind racing. Who would be standing out there in this weather, just staring up at my window? And why? For a moment I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. I considered calling someone, anyone, but what would I say? That there was a strange figure in the rain? It sounded ridiculous. Maybe it was just someone caught in the storm looking for shelter. But deep down I knew that wasn't it. There was something unnerving about the way they had stood there, completely still, as if they were there for a reason. After what felt like an eternity, I mustered the courage to peek through the curtains again. My hand trembled as I pulled back the fabric, just enough to see outside. The figure was gone. The yard was empty. The only movement, the rain pelting the ground and the trees swaying in the wind. I let out a shaky breath, trying to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it had been a branch or a trick of the light after all. But as I lowered my gaze, something caught my eye. A wet footprint smeared across the outside of the window pane. It was impossible. The window was too high off the ground for anyone to reach, and yet there it was, clear as day, a single muddy footprint pressed against the glass. My blood ran cold as I stared at it, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. Panic surged through me. I quickly drew the curtains shut again, my thoughts spiraling. The figure hadn't just been standing outside. They had been close enough to leave a mark on the window. And now, they were gone, vanished into the storm without a trace. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I checked the locks again, double and triple checking that everything was secure. But no matter how many times I checked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The storm raged on through the night, but I didn't sleep. I sat in bed, every creak of the house, every gust of wind sending a jolt of fear through me. I kept the curtains drawn, too afraid to look outside again. The shadowy figure haunted my thoughts, the footprint on the window a chilling reminder that they had been real. Morning finally came, the storm giving way to a gray, overcast sky. The world outside was drenched and quiet, as if nothing had happened. But when I finally worked up the nerve to open the curtains, the footprint was gone, washed away by the rain. I never saw the figure again, but the memory of that night stayed with me. The shadow in the window, the wet footprint, the sense of being watched. They all lingered in the back of my mind, a reminder that some things can't be explained. Even now, on stormy nights, I can't help but glance out the window, half expecting to see that dark silhouette standing there staring up at me once more. The forgotten room. It was one of those nights where the rain seemed like it would never stop. Sheets of water pounded against the windows, and the wind howled like a wild animal. I had been looking forward to a quiet evening at home, curled up on the couch with a good book, enjoying the cozy warmth of my living room while the storm raged outside. The kind of night where you're grateful to be indoors, sheltered from the chaos outside. As the rain intensified, I found myself lulled into a comfortable rhythm. The occasional crack of thunder was nothing more than a background noise to the comforting crackle of the fireplace. I had just settled deeper into my blanket, losing myself in the pages of my book, when I heard something that made me pause, a faint creaking sound coming from above. At first I dismissed it. The house was old, and it often made noises, especially during a storm. But this sound was different. It wasn't the typical groan of settling wood or the gust of wind forcing its way through a loose window. This was distinct, deliberate, like the sound of footsteps on the floorboards above me. I lived alone, and the room directly above the living room was rarely used. I couldn't remember the last time I had even been up there. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Perhaps I had left a window open, and the wind was causing something to shift. But as the creaking continued, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was moving around up there. Reluctantly, I set my book aside and stood up, listening carefully. The sound stopped abruptly, as if whatever, or whoever, was making it knew I was now aware. The silence that followed was almost more unsettling than the noise itself. I told myself it was just my imagination, spurred on by the storm and the eerie atmosphere it had created. Still, I felt compelled to check it out, if only to put my mind at ease. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer, just in case the power went out, and headed towards the staircase. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, my unease growing with every creak of the old wood beneath my feet. As I reached the top of the stairs, I hesitated, shining the flashlight down the hallway. The beam of light wavered as my hand trembled slightly, but everything looked as it should, dusty, unused, and completely ordinary, except for one thing. The door to the guest room, the one I rarely used, was slightly ajar. I was certain I had closed it the last time I was up here. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. For a moment, I considered turning back, going downstairs, and locking myself in the safety of my bedroom until morning. But my curiosity got the better of me. I had to know what was going on. I approached the door slowly, the sound of the rain growing muffled as I entered the hallway. When I reached the door, I paused, taking a deep breath before pushing it open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the beam of my flashlight as it swept across the space. Everything seemed normal at first glance. The bed was neatly made, the furniture covered in a thin layer of dust. But as I stepped further into the room, I noticed something that stopped me cold. In the center of the floor was a trail of muddy footprints. They led from the doorway to the far corner of the room, where the light from my flashlight barely reached. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I followed the trail, my breath catching in my throat. The footprints were fresh, the mud still wet, and they definitely weren't mine. As I reached the corner of the room, my flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls. I aimed the light at the floor, expecting to see more footprints. But instead, I found something even more disturbing. The footprints led to a small, old wooden closet, one that I didn't remember ever seeing before. The door to the closet was slightly open, just like the room had been. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, half expecting something to jump out at me. With a deep breath, I pulled the door open. Inside The closet was empty, except for a single tattered piece of clothing hanging from a rusted hook. It was a child's dress, faded and worn, as if it had been there for years. I felt a chill run down my spine as I reached out to touch it. The fabric was damp, and the air inside the closet was cold and musty. As I stood there, staring at the dress, the door to the room suddenly slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. I spun around, my flashlight flickering wildly, plunging the room into darkness for a brief, terrifying moment. When the light finally stabilized, I found myself alone in the room, the door closed and the sound of the rain pounding against the window once again filling the silence. I rushed to the door and yanked it open, my heart racing as I bolted down the stairs. I didn't stop until I was back in the living room, where the fire had burned down to embers. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I tried to calm myself. I didn't know what I had just experienced, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going back upstairs for the rest of the night. I sat on the couch, clutching my phone, listening to the rain and trying to make sense of what had just happened. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off to sleep. My mind filled with images of muddy footprints and that old tattered dress. The next morning, I awoke to find the storm had passed, leaving behind a bright, sunny day. But the events of the previous night were still fresh in my mind. I cautiously made my way back upstairs, half expecting to find everything as I had left it. But when I reached the guest room, I found the door wide open, the room empty and undisturbed. There were no footprints, no muddy trail, and no closet in the corner. The dress was gone, as if it had never existed. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. I've tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just a vivid nightmare brought on by the storm. But deep down, I know something was there, something that didn't want to be found. The flickering lights. It was one of those nights where the storm seemed determined to make its presence felt. The rain battered the windows with an almost violent intensity, and the occasional rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. I was home alone, relishing the rare solitude, but the storm had brought with it an uneasy feeling. I was sitting in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book, when I noticed the lights start to flicker. At first, I dismissed it as a quirk of the weather. Storms often played havoc with the electricity, and a few flickering lights were nothing unusual. But as the flickering persisted, I began to feel uneasy. It wasn't random. It was almost as if the lights were flickering in a pattern. I watched as the lights in the living room dimmed and brightened, then turned my head to see the same thing happening in the hallway. The flickering seemed to be moving through the house, like something was drawing it toward a specific place. My curiosity piqued, and with a growing sense of dread, I decided to investigate. The hallway was dim, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. I made my way down the corridor, following the strange pattern as it seemed to lead me deeper into the house. The kitchen lights were flickering now, but not the dining room. Then the bathroom, but not the study. It was as if the lights were guiding me, or rather, leading me somewhere. Finally, I reached a room I rarely used, a small guest room at the far end of the house. As I approached, the flickering grew more intense, until suddenly the lights went out completely. The house was plunged into darkness, save for a faint, unnatural glow coming from under the bed in the guest room. My heart raced as I stood at the doorway, staring into the darkness of the room. The glow under the bed was soft but unmistakable, casting just enough light to show the outline of the bed's frame. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but my curiosity and a morbid sense of duty pushed me forward. I stepped into the room, my breath shallow, and knelt down to peer under the bed. The glow was coming from an old, dusty box that I didn't recognize. Slowly, with trembling hands, I pulled the box out. As I opened it, the glow intensified for a moment, then faded, revealing its contents: an old, cracked mirror and a small, weathered notebook. The mirror was strange, almost unsettling. Its surface was scratched and tarnished, yet when I looked into it, I didn't see my reflection. Instead, I saw a different room. A room that wasn't in my house. It was as if the mirror was showing me another place, or perhaps another time. The image flickered, just like the lights had, and then vanished, leaving only my pale reflection staring back at me. Shaken, I picked up the notebook. The pages were yellowed with age, and the handwriting inside was faint but legible. It was a journal of some sort, detailing the life of someone who had once lived in this house. The entries spoke of strange occurrences, flickering lights, mysterious sounds, and a growing sense of unease that mirrored my own experience. The final entry was chilling. The lights lead to the room. The box must never be opened. As I read those words, the lights in the room flickered back on, bright and steady. The house was silent again, but the unease remained. I quickly closed the box and shoved it back under the bed, my hands trembling. I left the guest room, closing the door behind me, and returned to the living room, trying to shake off the fear that had settled in my chest. The storm outside had subsided, but the tension inside the house was palpable. I knew I wouldn't be sleeping that night. Every creak, every flicker of light would remind me of the box under the bed and the warning in the journal. From that night on, I couldn't bring myself to enter that room again. The box remained where I had found it, untouched and unopened, but the memory of that eerie glow and the flickering lights haunted me. I never told anyone about what happened that night, but I knew deep down that the house was trying to tell me something I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. The Uninvited Visitor. The rain had been falling steadily all evening, a constant soothing sound that filled the house. I was enjoying the quiet, the rhythmic drumming on the roof, almost lulling me to sleep. It was late, and the storm had created a sense of isolation, the kind that made the world outside seem far away. I was about to turn in for the night when I heard a knock at the door. It was sharp and sudden, cutting through the sound of the rain and sending a jolt of surprise through me. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially at this hour. The storm had made the streets deserted, and the idea of someone braving the downpour to visit me seemed unlikely. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Something didn't feel right. I peered through the peephole, straining to see through the rain-soaked night. But there was nothing there, just the dark, empty street and the sheets of rain cascading down. Relieved, I turned away from the door, chalking the knock up to a figment of my imagination, or maybe just the wind playing tricks. But before I could take a step, the knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. A shiver ran down my spine. I turned back to the door, hesitating for a moment before cautiously opening it a crack. The cold air rushed in, along with the sound of the rain. But again, there was no one there. The porch was empty, the street beyond silent and deserted. Just as I was about to close the door, I noticed something on the doorstep. A small, soaked package, no bigger than a shoebox. There was no return address, no markings, nothing to indicate where it had come from. It was just sitting there, waterlogged and unassuming. Curiosity got the better of me, and I bent down to pick up the package. It was heavier than I expected, and as I brought it inside, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. I placed the package on the kitchen table, staring at it as the water dripped from the soaked cardboard onto the floor. Carefully, I opened it, peeling back the damp layers to reveal its contents. Inside was a small, folded piece of paper, old and yellowed with age. My heart raced as I unfolded it, my fingers trembling. Written in spidery handwriting, the note contained only 4 words. I'm already inside. Panic surged through me as I dropped the note, my eyes darting around the room. The house suddenly felt much colder, the shadows in the corners darker and more menacing. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own rapid breathing and the relentless rain outside. I backed away from the table, my mind racing. I had to get out of the house. I had to find out who had left the package and what they meant by those terrifying words. But as I moved toward the door, something stopped me. A feeling, a presence, as if I wasn't alone. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whoever or whatever had left that package wasn't outside in the rain. They were inside the house, watching me, waiting. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows deepening as my fear grew. I bolted for the front door, throwing it open and rushing out into the rain without looking back. The cold water soaked through my clothes, but I didn't care. I needed to get away, to put as much distance between myself and that house as possible. I never went back. I left everything behind. My belongings, my home, everything. The memory of that night haunted me, the 4 words etched into my mind. I'm already inside. They were a reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved, and that sometimes the scariest things aren't what's outside in the storm, but what's waiting inside, just out of sight.